Welcome to Just Liberty, where justice and liberty meet. I'm Alan Reinach, Executive Director of the Church State Council, and my co-host with us is Bettina Krause, Editor of Liberty Magazine. And as today's interview will demonstrate, we are very much not just trying, but recovering religious liberty from the political extreme. So Bettina, introduce our guest, please.
So our guest today is Stanley Carlson-Thies, who is the founder and senior director of the Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance, which is a division of the Center for Public Justice. And Stanley served in the inaugural White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships under President George W. Bush, and we'll be talking a bit about that today. But since that time, he really has become known as the go-to expert on all things related to the federal faith-based initiative, which is, of course, the initiative that allows thousands of faith-based organizations to deliver social services on behalf of the federal government. So, Stanley, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm glad to be with you. I'm always uneasy when somebody introduces me as an expert in anything because maybe I won't be.
Well, that's fine. We'll just not question anything you say. We'll
Okay.
just take it as read that you're the expert on this.
Yeah.
But really, Stanley, quite seriously, you are an expert in the sense that you were there at the beginning. I mean, really, you understand the background to this whole topic that we're talking about today. Faith-based organizations involved in delivering federally funded services. Can you take us back to that time? Yeah, it was the early 2000s, right? And what happened? How did this whole thing get off the ground?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have to even go back before that into the early 90s. The way the federal government and state and local governments delivered services was typically by contracting with and giving grants to private organizations to provide whatever was needed, drug treatment or childcare, and so on. And people started across the spectrum in Washington started to say, we're not getting a very good bang for our buck. We're spending a lot of money. It's not helping people as well as it should, particularly with welfare reform. We actually had a Democratic presidential candidate, Bill Clinton, who ran in 1992 on a platform in part to end welfare as we know it. A Democrat, it needs to be better, so it needs to be different. And in that context, there also started to appear all these stories about faith-based organizations that seem to be doing a lot better than conventional services, including helping with kids getting into gangs and into violence, and the so-called Boston Miracle, a big turnaround in homicides when pastors and Black churches started working with juvenile justice system and then talking to the young people about what choices they were making and all that. So in the middle of that, some enterprising church-state lawyers said maybe we could tweak the rules for federal funding so that these organizations that have a faith commitment and also community-based organizations could become part of the mix. And that tweaking of the rules started in 1996 with federal welfare reform that included a small section of legal language called charitable choice. And the language just said that instead of the government kind of looking with suspicion on religious organizations as if maybe they didn't belong at the table, instead it ought to just judge them for what they did and how well they did it, while at the same time making sure that government money wasn't spent on say Bibles instead of services.
So
like
Stanley,
that.
let's put this in context, because certainly all of the major denominations have been operating aid organizations, development and relief. You've got groups like Catholic Charities, Lutheran World Services, there are Jewish organizations. Our own Seventh-day Adventist Church has ADRA. So the idea of government funding working in partnership with development and aid organizations was a long-standing practice. How did charitable choice and the faith-based initiative, how did that expand or change what had already been in place?
Yeah, that's the exact question, because there were these partnerships with what the government called religiously affiliated providers. And that kind of meant that the provider themselves had to be essentially secular, but they were connected with a denomination. Overseas, I think the rules were much looser because it's overseas. But here, basically, Catholic Charities, Adventist services, whatever, were supposed to be essentially delivering secular services the way the government itself has to do. I think what Charitable Choice came along and said is there could be these broader partnerships with other organizations, including even houses of worship, that are doing genuinely good out in the community. Um, and the government can partner with them as long as certain rules are followed. And they don't have to first remove all their indices of religious character and so on. And so I think that was the big change, was instead of the government having to say, have you become secular enough that we can work with you? Let's just invite you in and then make sure that what you do uh, uh, provides the public good that we're looking for. And I think that was a big change.
I remember, Stanley, I had first arrived from Australia in I guess it was the end of the 1990s, early 2000s. I remember that this was a big news story, and there was actually a lot of outrage around this new initiative. It was seen as something unprecedented. It was seen as dangerous. It was seen as preferring religion, and there are a lot of really negative prognostications about what the impact of this was going to be. How has that played out? And really, should faith-based organizations be delivering services on behalf of the government?
Yeah. Well, I think that latter question, a really important part of it, is on the faith-based side itself. So organizations have to decide, is this appropriate for us? Working with the government, of course, it has a lot of restrictions and ought to, because you're using tax money and you're working with vulnerable people, and many of them don't belong to your denomination, and you have to record things and get audited. And so organizations themselves have to decide, and can they fit within the rules? From the government side, I think, that it was right to have questions, because, what happens, here's a service that's supposed to be available to everybody, and everybody is not an Adventist or a Muslim or, conservative Protestant, something like that. And yet these kinds of organizations that are allowed to be kind of true to themselves are still going to be delivering those services. So how's that going to work? So people had to spend a lot of time thinking about that. I think the good thing is that the original rules, while imperfect, took all these things into account. On the one side, let's allow the wide range of religious organizations to take part. But on the other side, let's make sure that the way that they take part doesn't exclude any person who doesn't belong to that faith or doesn't want faith to be part of the service. And so there were some pretty careful rules that were there from the very beginning that tried to balance those two sets of rights. You could call it religious exercise for both the organization and the beneficiary. And part of religious exercise is to not have to take part in religion. And so there's some pretty careful rules that have been there from the beginning.
So Stanley, I want to approach this, there's kind of the legal aspects of how church and state interrelate and constitutional principles, but there's also the political. And, I remember going to a program in San Diego put on by the administration to tout the program within churches. And it certainly appeared that it was very much a sort of a right-wing effort to recruit inner city pastors and churches to be more receptive to conservative politics, that, the Republicans were trying to use this as a way to reach out to constituencies that did not generally vote Republican. And so there certainly was a concern that the rules that you've described, the safeguards, were were not necessarily as vigorous as they might have been. Talk about some of the politics of, well, and those are perceptions. Whether they were reality or not, I'm asking, right? I'm not making assumptions.
Yeah. So that's good. I will say, the Bush faith-based office in the White House, there were also and still are centers, faith-based centers, it's called that, in major agencies, because it's the agencies that actually, have the regulations and award the funds and construct the programs. But the White House is there to kind of say, let's make sure we don't close down the channels. Um, the the White House faith-based office under George W. Bush, beginning, was almost entirely Democrats. Um, John DiIulio, who ran it, I was at the time a registered Democrat. All my colleagues were Democrats. It did matter to George W. Bush, and I think later on it became more politicized. And administrations are like that, and they figure we're doing something good. We ought to get credit for it. We ought to use it to make sure we can stay here. So there was a lot of back and forth about that aspect of it, with some pushback from the inside. So I think there was some concern like that. But part of the outreach, Alan, it went on to all kinds of places. I went to the annual convention of the Islamic Society of North America, for example, to say this is what the new rules are. I talked at very liberal Jewish organizations and everything else. So we went to a lot of different places, and of course, you tailor your message a little bit to what the audience was. You felt excluded. We're trying to do things differently, and so on. So, but for sure, governments are political, and there were people, we saw them. Sometimes I think we felt like they were sharks surrounding the what we were trying to do, who were saying, how do we take credit for this, or let's make sure we send out, the president to a state where maybe it's kind of marginal voting, and it'll get people on our side. So that's part of it.
Well, one quick or not so quick follow-up question, though, because obviously the Obama administration continued the program. And so, it would be an unfair critique to say, oh, it's just a right-wing type of effort, because obviously was perceived by the Obama administration also to have value. I'm wondering, were there significant changes from a Republican to a Democrat administration in terms of how the interaction between government and the faith-based organizations and what the rules were? Were there things that, the Republicans were looser with, that the Democrats were tighter with, or the other way around? How did their approach differ?
Yeah, so that's really good. I think, one of the, as you suggested, one of the really amazing things is that this has continued over multiple administrations, starting with the original legislation during the Clinton years, and then Bush, and then Obama, and then Trump, and now Biden. And I'd say the same body of principles has continued, but it's been tweaked differently by each administration. And I think it's partly because how do you prove that you're active in governments? By changing things. And so you have to, including the name. So, it started out to the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, and then it became the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. Then it became the Office of Faith and Opportunity Initiatives under Trump, and now it's back to faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. So that's a sign of this. We got to get our name on it. Just like you drive down the road, my governor's picture is on the sign when you get to Maryland. But there has been a little bit of changes, and some of that is a response to Supreme Court changes of doctrine, which have evolved. Some of it is actually, I think, a response to actual things on the ground. This is not working very well. We need to change this. But part of it, I think, is due to, let's say, on the Democratic side, a little bit more concern about establishment concerns and about the rights of beneficiaries. And on the Republican side, a little bit more concerned about free exercise and then the rights of the organizations that might want to take part. So there's been some jockeying, and that's actually happened very recently, in which I think we could say that the Obama version of the Bush rules were very close. And then President Trump came in and said, yeah, so those basic principles are fine, but we want to tweak them because some religious organizations we think are unjustly kept out. And some of the things that they're required to do, we don't think are fair. And I think some of that critique was actually correct. The way the rules had developed was that a person who thought that the provider they went to, they objected to their religion, something like that, they were allowed to ask for a different provider. But that's quite a burden to put on an organization that's offering services. And that burden was only placed on the religious providers and not on the secular ones. And so President Trump said that's not an equal burden. Unfortunately, then he said, we're not going to have referrals for anybody. I think that was the wrong solution. And so now President Biden has come back and said, no, there's going to be a chance for everybody, but it's going to be applied to both secular and religious providers. So some tweaking like that. But I think you'd have to say the basic principles have been quite constant. And even back in the 90s, Bettina, you're quite right. When this thing happened, a lot of people said, but wait a second, doesn't that violate the Constitution? Or isn't that going to be bad for religious organizations or the government or something? And very quickly, the Church State Institute at Baylor University put on a conference on, constitutional law people and people from Catholic Charities, and I was there and others, to kind of discuss all these things. And in the van going back and forth from the hotel to whatever, we had a lot of discussions across, different points of view. And there was, and also made an agreement, since many of us were from Washington, that when we got back to Washington, we ought to have a lot of conversation about this going forward. And in that conversation included the American Jewish Committee and Baptist Joint Committee and Separation of Church and State, and many others, National Association of Evangelicals, Catholic Church, and others. And for 2 or 3 years, we just had discussions on what Congress had passed. Was that constitutional or not? And out of it came a document called In Good Faith. And there wasn't total agreement, but there was a very extensive agreement that, for example, if the rules would allow a faith organization to actually incorporate faith into their service, well, then you had to make sure that people had a choice of picking a different kind of thing, right? Or else that would be totally wrong. So a lot of discussion like that. And then Bush came along, put a lot of these principles into regulations. When President Obama decided to go along, one of the first things he did was construct an advisory council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships, included Human Rights Campaign and Southern Baptists, and Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I mean, very, very broad. And one of the tasks of that advisory council was to look at the Bush rules. And Melissa Rogers, who is now the White House director, she ran that discussion. And over a year and a half, we looked at every detail of the charitable choice and equal treatment regulations. And at the end of the day, basically that council said, we think this is constitutional. We'd like you to expand notice of rights that's given to people and a few things like that. But people said, this is basically the way it ought to be done. So there's been a very large amount of conversation back and forth about the boundaries and the central principles.
So what you're describing, Stanley, is sort of like a constant through line, but with some nuances, brought in by each administration to reflect different concerns. But I want to focus on President Biden's recent regulations, the rule that I think comes into effect the month that we're recording, April. I saw and have seen a number of critiques which seem to say that these new regulations are really going to impose unacceptable burdens on faith-based organizations as they deliver social services. And they make quite a strident case. And their voices also that, carry some heft in constitutional circles. What is your feeling on the new regulations? Are they really materially going to change how this system works?
Yeah.
And what burden are we talking about? I'm now mystified here.
Yeah. Well, so I think there are ongoing discussions about all of this. So one thing I do is a monthly discussion amongst faith-based organizations and some religious freedom attorneys and so on. And this is going to be a main topic on Thursday when we talk. So what are the nuances of it? Is it really that different? Are there really these problems? I don't share that concern myself. And one thing I would say I think is happening is that some church states experts, constitutional lawyers, they're saying we see the Supreme Court going in this direction, and instead of following where we think the Supreme Court's going, they're not there yet, but where we think it's going, instead of following that, the Biden administration is kind of stuck with a older framework. Well, I think I would say until the Supreme Court gets to a new place, you can't write new rules based on where you think it's going to go. And the dispute there, Alan, it has to do with this question of how can faith organizations be present with all their vigor, put it that way, but then people who need help, who have all kinds of different views, how can you make sure that they can get help that's appropriate for them? And particularly because the government often just funds like one variety of a service in some location. And if
So
that variety
are
of
we talking, for example, about whether adoption services have to serve same-sex couples, that sort of thing?
well, that could be one of it. It could be that in a job training program, people want to say, I get it that you've had a lot of difficulty over the years because you've been discriminated against or beaten down, but you're a precious child of God. And let's kind of walk you through some things about your identity as well as just give you job training. And that may be very effective for some people. But, if that packaging is Jewish and you're Muslim, or it's Southern Baptist and you're Jewish or something, it may not be very effective or appropriate. So how do you make sure that mismatch isn't going to happen? And so I think the Biden people have just said those Trump rules were just a little bit too expansive, and that would be problematic for people. So the Biden rules kind of stress again a difference between if the funding goes directly to a provider, they're essentially a single provider, then they can't have religion be part of their service. They can offer it on the side, but it can't be part of the service. And some people find that too restrictive. I just think there has to be a way of respecting the rights of both parties. And if there's only one provider, then I think you just can't say we're going to be full bore religious in our service. So I personally would like the government to instead contract with a range of providers, because some people find a faith infused, either they trust it more or it appeals more to the problems they're having, or it may just be more expert and they feel comfortable with it. So I think to be more plural is a good idea.
Well, the whole notion of monopoly is, offensive to our sort of free market system, that there ought to be alternatives, and, nobody gets to monopolize.
That's right.
And those who object, the abortion providers who object, say, to serving same-sex couples, they insist, well, there are other providers that can provide those services. They don't have to come to us.
You mean adoption service?
I'm sorry, yeah.
It's really easy for the government to say, we want 1,000 units of something. Who's the biggest group out there that can do 1,000 units? Then you don't have to manage 4 contracts. But I think sometimes you just have to say it's better for the people you're trying to serve to give them a variety. Maybe that's one reason why in higher education we have 4,000 institutions and not one, that everybody doesn't have to be a branch of Harvard University or something. And by the way, those universities get a lot of federal dollars, and they're not required to become less Adventist or less Catholic. Or Zaytuna College out in Berkeley doesn't have to become less Muslim because their students carry Pell Grants to them. And why do we allow that? Well, because it could be a valuable part of education. People have a choice. Why don't we just let them take the money where they find it more useful? I think we need more of that kind of pluralism in our system. But we've been getting more of it over these 30 years, and I think that's ought to be really encouraging to us. But pluralism in a way that it doesn't impose conservative Christianity on anybody. It is about social services, but it's about allowing a diversity of social services to be present.
So, Stanley, over the years that you have observed this initiative and been involved in it,
yeah.
What is your overall assessment of the net impact of it? Has it been overwhelmingly positive or not?
I think we've gotten to a much better place than we used to be. So I would say very, very positive. I want to just read to you, this is from somebody, not myself, a church state expert, Robert Tuttle, who just said, this is back in 2007, I think we've seen about the most dramatic administrative change that's possible for those inside the Beltway to conceive. The idea that you go from a government that was in form as well as practice quite hostile to many kinds of religious organizations participating in funding to one of which there's basically equal treatment of them. That's a really significant change. And it really helped when we came to COVID-19. Many people just did not want to go to this public health clinic or that place. But when the government was willing to talk to pastors and religious organizations, then there was much better communication about problems, people wrestling with their moral quandaries. There were vaccination clinics that were actually held at religious properties and things like that in a way that I think would not have been possible 20 years before. So I think we're in a much better place, but that place, it's only better because there's been a lot of care about respecting free exercise for everybody, which is what we ought to do.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I've watched this from a distance for all these years, and I've known you over the years some, but to actually get this history has just been a wonderful, wonderful time spent.
Yeah, well, good. Thanks for asking me to be on. Yeah.
What strikes me most, Bettina, is how a real consensus appears to have developed about what on its surface seems to be a rather dramatic shift from the way that church and state used to relate for the first couple of centuries of American life, which was, pretty hands off, to now, having a real partnership. That's, quite a difference, isn't it?
It surprised me too that people who, had such profoundly different ideological frameworks on many other things were able to find consensus on the fact that faith-based organizations are good for American society, and that they can partner with the federal government in a careful way that that's a win-win for everyone. It's shocking to me that all the administrations since this first appeared in the late 1990s have retained this initiative, which speaks to its inherent success, right?
Well, and listening to Stanley and I've known him long enough to both respect and to trust him. Some of the foremost advocates of the separation of church and state have been engaged in this and looked at these rules, both scholars and activists. The person that Obama appointed, Melissa Rogers, she came out of the Baptist Joint Committee, which is a very, staunchly separationist organization, and she was an academic at Wake Forest for a while. But no, people who are very knowledgeable and well respected. It's here to stay. That's for sure.
So maybe, Alan, there's reason to hope that the art of consensus is not dead.
I think that within the faith community and the religious liberty community, there's a lot of relationships and strange bedfellows, perhaps. But uh, even as there are these sharp culture war, sort of battles going on. So it's not black and white, and it's very interesting for us to be able to do our Just Liberty broadcast and give our listeners a little bit more of the nuance of what's really going on.
So, on that very hopeful note, Alan, we'll end the show there. This has been Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. We'll see you next time. And until then, remember, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.